Here we are again. Hello, everybody. Today we're going on to 204, and I hope you are keeping up with the other units. You all seem to be producing work every week, which is really great. Don't forget, please, dates, sources. You must have those sources in with obviously the pages, names, dates, all that sort of stuff. But apart from that, everything's going really well. Right, 204. Now you can download the award evidence sheet when you go into 204 in resources. It is in handouts. One thing, make sure you use the handouts marked Nigel. It's because the other handouts are used by a different assessor, and I'm not so keen on those, and they're not keen on mine. So today, well, here's the sheet. It's best if you can download it. So today we're going to look at outcome 1 and the first part of outcome 2. Now, as you can see, it says equality, diversity and inclusion in work with children and young people. Sounds a bit boring, but it's something that is very real in schools now. I'll give you a little bit of history. Certainly when I was at school, I never saw anyone at all who was disabled, mentally or physically, and as I grew up, I continued not to see children and in fact adults who had these disabilities. Very rarely, very rarely you saw anyone in a wheelchair. Now, why was this? Well, we had a policy of basically putting certainly children and some adults into homes. All very well meaning. I'm not saying that they weren't very well run, but sometimes you sort of wonder. So that meant that anyone who had a bad physical disability, a mental disability, they ended up behind closed doors, and they were educated separately in those institutions. Now, certainly in the 1970s this started to change, because people were saying, well, this is not good for the people with the disabilities, and it's not actually good for the people who don't have a disability, because it's like, you know, two different groups of people. So it was decided in the 80s and 90s that children would be integrated into mainstream schools if the schools were able to provide the facilities, and B, if it suited the children. Now, some children, it would be better if they did stay in homes or specialist schools that would cater for particular disabilities. So, for example, if a child was blind or autistic, you know, schools for autistic pupils and so on. In fact, I did spend a year going to see TAs in a school for autistic children, and I've got to say, I have nothing but admiration for those TAs, and also the success I saw in that school from children who, well, they were just rocking in a corner, no communication whatsoever with the outside world, through to 15 and 16-year-olds taking exams and appearing, certainly on the surface, to be well-adjusted teenagers. Obviously, some of them had sort of deeper issues. For example, I spoke to one 16-year-old girl who had an American accent, and she seemed very, very capable, very outward going. And I thought, well, why is she here? But as it turns out, she just happened to be American that day. She was very good at accents. And also, she'd only just managed to come to school by herself on the bus. So there are levels of disability that we don't see. We only see the obvious things. Now, getting back to integration in schools. Now, this takes the form of, for example, if a child's in a wheelchair, it will be the provision of lifts, ramps, maybe little mini lifts, having doors that will automatically open, wider doorways, desks that automatically on motors will go up and down. For other children hard of hearing, there are hearing loops, which are electronic. It's an electronic system that links in with their earpiece. Say children who are with poor sight, you can have books with large print. You can print off from on a computer. You can print off large print worksheets. You can have large screen computers. There's all sorts of ways of doing this. And for children who are not very good, say with language, you can use something which is called Makaton, which is like a sign language, which I'll show you later, which a lot of teachers can use. Now, the key thing about this was when the government introduced this, they said, in effect, that if, for example, a school had to install a lift, that it had a reasonable amount of time to make the alterations. Because a lift will go from 100,000 upwards. So for a school suddenly to find 100,000 and to change all the doors and blah 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 blah. But over the years this has happened, and you will find this in shops and taxis and railways now. So it's been taken up by the whole of society now. So that's the background to the equality and the diversity inclusion. So we're including children who would have normally 40 years ago, say, been excluded from mainstream school. The equality and the diversity is where children, for example, it could be children with just come to this country, have poor language skills, English skills, so that's taken into account. Dyslexia, which I'm sure we've all heard of. All this is taken account of, and in the classroom the teacher will differ. It's called differentiation. You might come across this word. It means that each child has its own sort of work plan. Now, most, say the bulk of children in a class will have more or less the same plan, but then you will have certain pupils who need further help. Now, this could be academically, or it could even be behavioural. So they have a plan of action that called an ILP, Individual Learning Plan, and as a TA you will come across these children quite a lot, and in fact you may be working with these children, and you will have to follow this individual learning plan. And I will I will put a copy out for you later on so that you can see what this plan is like. So essentially, we take children as they are and we fit education around them to suit them. They don't have to make lots and lots of changes to fit into the education system. The education system will change to help them, and that's the key to all the legislation that is on worksheet 1. So if you look at your plan, the first outcome, worksheet 1, 1.1, is identify the current legislation and codes of practice relevant to the promotion of equality and valuing of diversity. Now, there are a few items that I want you to take note of. Now, when you look at that worksheet, you will see it covers different aspects of key of laws and codes of practice. I want you to also, before we start, to look at page 55. Now on page 55 we can see the diagram here, and this shows how laws, legislation is made in Parliament and how that works in schools. Now if you look at the book, I'll have to explain it to you, but it